Cultures vary, and they vary widely. What I'd like to do in this lecture is to take a look at some of this variance, at the way cultures differ from one another, and on how we know that they differ from one another. We're going to do this by exploring the best known and most thoroughly researched of the approaches to cross-cultural communication, that associated with Geert Hofstede, whose model of cross-cultural differences is primary and is probably the most important and best known one out there. Hofstede has found, after a research project that has lasted several decades, that there are certainly 5 dimensions, and there may be more, of differences among cultures. Let me go through those 5 dimensions quickly before going into them in greater depth. The first dimension is individualism versus collectivism. How individualistic versus how group-oriented a culture is defined by this dimension. The second dimension is power distance. Power distance should be thought of as something like the amount of inequality of all kinds that a culture accepts as normal, particularly power differences. High power distance cultures have large gaps among social classes and economic groups. The third dimension in Hofstede's model is masculinity versus femininity. These are probably the wrong words, but they're words we've inherited from the first iteration of the Hofstede model decades ago. They don't refer to biological gender. They refer to something like assertiveness and receptivity, not biological gender. And they associate masculine qualities with one set of those characteristics and feminine qualities with another. Again, we're stuck with the terminology, but it's not optimal. The fourth dimension has to do with risk and attitudes towards risk and uncertainty. Cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance are risk averse, cautious about innovation, cautious about change. Whereas countries that are lower in uncertainty avoidance have less risk aversion and may even welcome chance. And finally, Hofstede defines long-term and short-term time orientations in cultures. Short-term time orientation cultures tend to look for quick returns. They're not patient with capital, for example, whereas long-term cultures are much more comfortable making plans that will take us out over extended time horizons. Now, how do you find out where a culture is on these dimensions? The Hofstede organization has made available a website where you can type in the name of one or more countries and get a printout of where the country stands on the 5 dimensions. You might want to take a break in this lecture now and try entering this URL and playing around with what you get out of it. You'll find that when you enter the name of a country, you'll get a bar chart display giving you the country's relative standing to other countries in the world on these 5 dimensions. I'm going to go through the 5 dimensions now individually and talk about each of the characteristics. So there are 10 of them. Characteristics that a culture is high in or characteristics that a culture is low in. The first of these dimensions is individualism versus collectivism. As I mentioned a little while ago, this has to do with orientation towards society. Individualism defines how individualistic a culture is, how much it relies on the lone actor, how much it respects the lone actor versus groups. Collectivism, though, is a group orientation, a group identity. What characterizes high individualistic cultures? We find that highly individualistic cultures, cultures like the United States and Australia, for example, people are inclined to speak their minds. These tend to be task-oriented cultures. They tend to be somewhat egalitarian. They tend to look on obligations and benefits as something or things that are available to everybody in the culture. Everyone has a personal opinion on a topic in these cultures. So individualistic cultures value expression. They value people taking opinions, taking stands, and then acting on those opinions and stances. They tend to see the employment world as transactional. When thinking about the relationship between employer and employee, they tend to emphasize what you as an employee need to do and what you as an employee will get as a result of doing it. The work relationship is largely confined to that kind of transaction. People freely make eye contact in highly individualistic cultures. And that's not something that's universally shared. Eye contact is a good example of how misunderstandings can arise in cross-cultural issues. In highly individualistic cultures like the United States, we tend to value eye contact. And if people are speaking with us and not maintaining eye contact, we tend to become uneasy and tend to make some assumptions about their motivations and their interest and perhaps even their intentions. But there are cultures in which gaze aversion, not making eye contact, is a symbol of respect and politeness. Many Middle Eastern cultures are like this. Many East Asian cultures are as well. When dealing with cultures like that, understand that not making direct eye contact is not a sign of boredom or lack of interest. It may be a sign of politeness or deference. In individualistic cultures, men and women are relatively free to cross over in job and professional roles. Those roles are not rigidly defined. They're not prescribed for people. They're much more fluid, and various kinds of social roles, including employment roles, are in principle and often in practice open to both men and women. Individuals may tend to be sole actors and may tend to be loners in these kinds of cultures. Individuals are not as tightly connected to groups as they are in other cultural characteristics, which we'll explore in this lecture. High collectivism characterizes cultures that have a real strong group orientation. So if you're in a high collective culture, a culture like Japan or Korea or China or Vietnam, the group is really important and you're very close to your in-groups. In-groups being your company, your family, your close social circle. You've got a strong identity with them. And that identity is more important than your individual identity and individual goals, intentions, and aspirations. On the other hand, in high collectivism, people who are out-group members are very distant. We tend to interact with them less, and when we interact with them, we tend to do so more formally. One of the important goals of highly group-oriented cultures is harmony. We tend in these cultures not to value significant disagreement and conflict. The goal is to achieve group and interpersonal balance. These are not transactional cultures, as highly individualistic cultures are. Relationships tend to take precedent over tasks. So we focus on the quality of our interactions, particularly with in-group members, and make those primary as motivators for our behaviors, our attitudes, and our communication practices. Laws, opinions, and rights differ by group in these cultures. Some groups are more highly ranked than other groups. That means they have more social status, more deference, and typically more resources than individuals do. One of the interesting characteristics of highly collective cultures is the use of shame and loss of face to sanction group members who break the codes, who aren't going along with the principles of high collectivism. Being shunned by the group, and in extreme cases being outcast by the group, is about the worst thing that can happen to you in a culture like this. Cultures like this tend to look on employment situations as something like family relationships. The boss or the CEO or the chair of the board is imagined to be something like a paternal figure, a father, someone who knows best, someone to whom others in the organization defer for rules, procedures, and benefits. Nonverbal messages are really important in these cultures. Now, they're important in all cultures, but in collective cultures, there tends to be a really well-articulated vocabulary of body language. Nuance, shadings of meaning are clear to members of the culture, but may be invisible to those from without. So communication goes on a number of channels really consciously in collective cultures. We watch gesture, tone of voice, facial expression, physical distance, use of touch, and those patterns of behavior are very well defined and very clear to people who know the rules and know the code. If you are from a highly individualistic culture, and you are doing a business deal with people from a highly collective culture, you might want to be sure to pay particular attention to nonverbals. Some of them may be hard, some of them may be impossible to translate directly, but there'll be a large array of them, and it pays to monitor them and to bring up in conversation any indications that people are uncomfortable or that there's dissatisfaction. Speakers tend to communicate differently. Within groups, people are very disclosive. They're very close to fellow in-group members, but they tend to be much more reticent, much more reluctant to share, much more reserved with out-group members. People will go a long way for their groups, and they'll expect that to be reciprocated. People's primary loyalty and their primary energies are seen as in the service of group identity. High versus low power distance is the second of the Hofstede dimensions. Power distance refers to the amount of structural inequality that a system like a culture will accept. Cultures like the United States are very low in power distance, at least in our stated goals and aspirations. The founding principle that all people are created equal is a low power distance statement. High power distance cultures, cultures like, for example, India, are structured around inequality. The caste into which you are born in India creates some possibilities and some limitations for you. They're not going to be absolute, but they're going to be real and definable within the context of people in the culture. Might makes right. Power is a good thing. It's a defining element of social structure. What characterizes the people higher in society is that they have and use more power. And power determines in these cultures much of what is considered to be right in attitudes and behaviors. High power is associated with privilege and with social status. It's respected, even venerated in cultures like this. Authority tends to be centralized around an organization's leader or a political figure's leadership. It doesn't tend to be dispersed throughout an organization, which means that most decisions are made at the top by or closely around somebody who is high in power and status. These cultures don't have a real high opinion of people's work ethic very often. The notion is that employees left to themselves will not function at 100%. Subordinates require close supervision. They require you as a manager to take an over-the-shoulder supervisory style, which limits the amount of independence and the degrees of freedom of the people whom you're supervising. The ideal boss is a good father, again, in this style, as it is in high individualism. It's a paternalistic system. Spoken language may be very formal. Spoken and written language may be very formal in these cultures. Remember that you will probably be encountering representatives of these cultures with you as an outgroup member. Communication is much looser and freer among in-group members. As soon as you become an outgroup member, there's a degree of formality, politeness, protocol that guides communication situations. These are pass the buck cultures, only the buck gets passed downward. People lower on the ladder take the hit when things go wrong. Low power distance countries, countries like most of them in Western Europe and the United States, have a very different set of characteristics. Their goals, sometimes stated in founding documents, as they are in the United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence, these cultures look to minimize or reduce inequalities among people, to put everybody on a common footing. There are cultures that don't like real well the use of a lot of very high-end status symbols. Although people do use them, they are known to be and recognized to be somewhat showy and flashy. That suggests difference, and low power distance cultures are low difference cultures. Low power distance cultures have an interesting attitude towards organizational hierarchies. We tend to be a little bit impatient with bureaucracies. We tend to see bureaucracies as mechanisms of red tape. Organizational structures, top to bottom, exist because we have to have them to get jobs done, not because these hierarchies are an end in themselves or a statement of social values. So for the business of getting business done, we accept power distances, but we don't invest in them heavily, and we try not to confuse them with other kinds of interpersonal perceptions and relationships. High power distance cultures are centralized. Low power distance cultures are decentralized. They very often espouse democratic values. They tend to trust local control more than central control. As a result, your subordinates will expect to be consulted on major decisions that involve them. This kind of culture is well suited to team-based organizational designs, designs that we'll talk about when we get into the leadership course in the second half of the upcoming semester. People expect to participate in significant decisions in low power distance cultures. Powerful people try to appear less powerful very often. They try not to exaggerate or emphasize their status. And if they do emphasize their status, they may be regarded pretty negatively. Conversationally, anyone can take the initiative, anyone can take the lead. In high power distance cultures, those are cultures of deference, and people with higher status are often the centerpieces in communication. That's very different in cultures like England, France, Germany, the United States. Masculinity and femininity. The third dimension, a dimension which is unfortunately misnamed. But as I said earlier, we're stuck with the names. Highly masculine cultures include, again, the United States. Highly feminine cultures include places like Nigeria, Russia, and Scandinavian nations. What does high masculinity look like? Well, it doesn't look necessarily like men. It looks like certain traits that are associated with assertiveness. This culture tends to value material success and progress. So how you do economically is an indication of your social value. They tend to be attracted to what's bigger, what's faster, and what's newer. So novelty is exciting, and innovation may be welcome. Men are expected to be assertive and tough and go-getters. Women are generally assumed to be compliant and subservient. Failing is very negative. Failing is one of the big liabilities of high masculine cultures. When cultures engage in conflict, when high masculine cultures engage in conflict, the style of conflict resolution is less like reasoned negotiation and more like argument. One of the things we're seeing in business negotiations in recent years is a kind of shift away from the high masculinity norms of conflict, the sort of approach to negotiation that is contained, for example, in Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. We tend to be less argumentative in the United States and Western Europe over time. But the use of argument is something like a default value for resolving conflicts and interpersonal differences. People in these cultures tend to be highly status-oriented, somewhat like what happens in highly individualistic cultures. These are cultures which think highly of overachievement, which are constantly pushing the goals, pushing the aspiration, going higher, going further, going bigger, going faster. Highly feminine cultures, on the other hand, are heavily invested in the have-nots. They're heavily invested in the social status of the disenfranchised and their needs, heavily invested in the environment and environmental restoration and well-being. The ideal is that people should be modest, soft-spoken, and empathetic with others. If you are credited with exceptional achievements, you tend to play them down. You tend to minimize them. So in this respect, they will look a little bit like highly collective cultures. They will not seek, individuals will not generally seek to outstrip others or to achieve higher social status than others. They're much more negotiation and compromise-oriented cultures. Highly masculine cultures, remember, tend to be argumentative. Highly feminine cultures tend to focus on reason and compromise and process. In the employment sector, compensation is very important, but quality of work life, the sense of employees having a purpose, broader than just making money for what they do. Those kinds of attitudes are primary in highly feminine cultures. Voice raising is rare. In a highly masculine culture, it may not be. But in highly feminine cultures, speakers tend to be more deferential and more conventionally polite. These folks are typically warm and friendly. They're unobtrusive. They don't push themselves forward. If there's a downside to this cultural style, it may be that they don't do well with assertiveness. And they may have a hard time in negotiation, for example, if they're faced with a team that's highly masculine in its assertiveness. It's something that highly feminine cultures struggle with. And it can make negotiations very complex. Attitudes towards uncertainty. High uncertainty avoidance characterizes cultures that don't like risk. Again, the United States is a pretty good example. We engage in risk, but we're not entirely comfortable with it. Short-term gains are the expectation. If you're hired as a CEO, your compensation will depend on how the next quarters and half years and annual reports go. We're not measuring you on your ability or rewarding you for your ability to set goals for 5 or 10 years out. We're much more short-term in focus. What's different is regarded as dangerous in highly uncertainty avoidant cultures. So they're conservative in that sense. They don't welcome what is a break with tradition very comfortably. Situations, people, and risks that are ambiguous and not well defined make folks in this kind of culture really nervous. Rules are important. Rules and hierarchies emerge as pretty significantly important, as they tend to be in high individualistic cultures as well. They're moralistic. Law is really clear, whether that law is codified in texts and in court decisions or whether it's enforced interpersonally. We have strong expectations about what's right and what's wrong, and we sanction behavior that's wrong. Very pragmatic in their orientation. Time is money, and they will be impatient with wasting either. They tend to be cultures that assume that they have a corner on the truth, that their way of seeing the world and organizing themselves is necessarily best because they do it. They're cultures in which people are expected to specialize, in which expertise is valued. But again, expertise and specialization are useful for reducing risk, for trying to ensure as much certainty, as much foreknowledge as possible in business ventures or in other social situations. These cultures are likely to be very highly verbal. They may be argumentative. They tend to be somewhat rigid. They're not real flexible in discussing their beliefs or their assumptions, and they will be argumentative in defending them. They tend to be judgmental. That is, they tend to take their cultural norms and use them as a yardstick by which to measure the social progress and value of other cultures out there. Cultures that have low uncertainty avoidance have much higher tolerance for ambiguity. China, Korea, Japan, for example. One of the big differences between those cultures and Western cultures like the United States is attitude towards risk and uncertainty. They'll tend to be impatient with high-risk ventures or to be uncomfortable with high-risk ventures. Some of their characteristics will shade into the dimension of long-term and short-term thinking. Low uncertainty avoidance cultures want guaranteed returns, and they want them, if possible, in the relatively short term. What's different in low uncertainty avoidance causes curiosity. In high uncertainty avoidance, it causes suspicion. But these cultures value novelty and they value innovation, and they're interested when the prospects for these things emerge. Socially, they may be conservative and rule-bound in other ways, but they're very good with novelty. They believe that rules should be minimized to those which are, strictly speaking, necessary. One of the ways that organizations manage risk sometimes is with hierarchies and rules. If you are easier with risk, you don't need the same degree of rule structuring. They tend not to be emotionally or affectively very confiding or outspoken. Aggression is something, even sometimes irritation or disagreement, may be some things to withhold. We will not share feelings very easily in cultures like this. Hard work is valued when it's necessary, but it's not seen to be a particularly desirable lifestyle. Now, this is different in some individual cultures. The notion, though, in a lot of low uncertainty avoidance settings, is that really hard work should be reserved for situations that really require it, and that the rest of our task environment consists of lower level goals, which can be managed without extreme hard work. As I said earlier, very high orientation towards innovation, towards novelty. Their communication style tends to be informal, and it tends to be unrushed. If you are negotiating, for example, with a group from Japan, the conversation is likely to seem to be protracted. The reason for that is, coming out of our culture, we are focused on the immediate, and our communication styles are driven to get the immediate goals realized. These cultures are not as fixated on that sort of immediacy, and communication tends to be more relaxed. Very pragmatic, really practical. When confronted with innovation, people in these cultures will seek where that innovation can be applied for better economic development or better lifestyles. Time orientation, finally, varies. Some cultures are much more long-term in their orientation. Some cultures are much more immediate, short-term in theirs. Long-term orientation cultures, a culture like Japan, for example, has a very strong work ethic. So high in conscientiousness, dedicated to their jobs, not a whole lot of turnover, strong commitment to the organization. These cultures value thrift and saving. Short-term cultures like the United States don't. I encountered a statistic the other day that an extraordinary percentage of American baby boomer generation members, an extraordinary percentage has less than $10,000 in accumulated retirement savings. Thrift, saving are not valued to the same extent in a short-term culture as they are in a long-term one. Long-term cultures are highly motivated. That is, they persevere, they stick with tasks and goals, and they're not easily dissuaded by negative returns, at least at the outset. They tend to be much more patient. In the 1970s, the Japanese automakers Datsun, now Nissan, and Toyota began branching into the North American market very aggressively. They did so with the expectation that profit was going to be deferred by years. They were patient with their capital, and they achieved real strong market position as a result of that patience over time. These cultures may be idealistic, so they may set very high goals and anchor themselves strongly to those goals. Those goals may be, to us, impractical or unrealistic. To them, these goals, such ideals, such norms are defining for culture. And they don't come or are regarded not to come easily. So they compel high commitment. These cultures are really good at adaptation. If you look, for example, at Japanese and Korean and Chinese industry, they're real good about taking products or services and adapting them to their particular contexts. So they get economic benefit out of going down roads that others don't explore. Success is real strongly valued in long-term cultures. Now, in the case of the Asian cultures, these are highly collective cultures. And as I said earlier, highly collective cultures enforce norms by shunning people or by causing them to lose face. In a strong long-term oriented culture, at least in many of them, long-term success is more important than face. So, if you believe you're on the right track, a track that will yield strong benefits down the road, you may be willing to accept lower social status or a degree of exclusion from the mainstream in pursuit of that success. Past and future generations matter a lot. China, Japan, Korea are strong ancestor-oriented cultures, and they're cultures that are real mindful of what future generations need and will need to pursue. Communication is direct, focused, and explicit.
Sorry, I'm having trouble understanding right now. Please try a little.
The United States is a short-term oriented culture. We're highly averse to loss of face. We need to look good. Presentation matters a lot. We're not willing to risk the perception of our status or our worth in the service of goals that may be intangible and substantially deferred in arriving. You'll experience strong social pressure to keep up, even if that means overspending. Now, the United States is a consumer culture, as are most of the Western European cultures. So, overspending is a way to keep up, and society presses us to do it. In fact, much of the economy depends on it. We value quick results. Again, if you're a CEO, you're going to be measured not on what you're doing and its effects 6, 7, 8 years down the road, but how what you're doing affects to annual, semi-annual, and even quarterly returns. That will determine your compensation, and it will determine your future prospects with an organization. These cultures may be somewhat traditional. That is, they may respect traditions strongly. So they may be a little bit conservative in that respect. Tradition breaking is not common in short-term orientation cultures, and people who are counter-tradition are sometimes suspect. These are cultures that are really closely attuned to what you need to do to get by in society. Now, a lot of that is keeping up with the Joneses. A lot of it is going along to avoid losing face. A lot of it is that social demands may derive from traditions. But those things are highly valued in these kinds of cultures. Personal stability, consistency is a high value, equated with trustworthiness and worth in general. Saving is not popular, so there may be relatively few resources available for investment, and very few available for very long-term investments. Very verbal in communication. So communication flows easily among these people. They talk readily, they communicate often. These cultures tend to be ceremonious and warm, but often formal, often driven by very clear interpersonal and social rules. Those are the 5 dimensions of culture according to Hofstede. Let me invite you to go back to that URL with which I started this presentation and invite you to play around with it. Go into the database and enter a couple of different countries in which you're interested and take a look at the display. You'll get dimension by dimension comparisons across the 3. In conclusion, then, cultures do vary, and they vary a lot. The 5 dimensions that emerged from the Hofstede studies over the decades are economical and valid ways to understand those differences, and going into business or social situations with people from other cultural contexts can and should impel you to understand what those contexts are, what those dimensions look like for those people, and being up to speed on that may make the process of business easier, more convenient, and ultimately more profitable.